Because I found out midway through the production of this video that today is actually Peter Gabriel's birthday, it will be coming out today instead of early next week as I had originally planned. But in any case, welcome to a new review. Today we will be talking about Peter Gabriel 4. I would not say that this is his best album by any standard. I actually think that the best Peter Gabriel album is still the one over my left shoulder. But this is a very interesting album nonetheless, and it's definitely the most experimental of his early albums, and probably of his entire career. This is nothing if not a technologies album. And in many respects, you could almost use this album as like a tech demo for the latest production sounds of music in the early 80s. It's all Linn drum machines and Fairlight CMIs, and it was digital, which I believe it was his first digital album. Very significant, you know, really early digital, but also. So it has some drawbacks in sound that you would not find in even digital from later in the 80s. And as I understand, this was influential in its own way. It was one of the first English language pop albums to use sampling very heavily, because apparently that was a function on the Fairlight CMI, which seems a little ridiculous to us today that that was something new and incredible, but it was mind-blowing back then. I say English speaking because certain artists internationally had already used sampling. I know in particular the Yellow Magic Orchestra very heavily used sampling on their '81 album Technodelic. But this was certainly one of the first to do it in the English-speaking world. As I said earlier, it's probably one of his most interesting albums, which is, a lot of that's helped by the fact that it is a genuinely weird album. And what I mean by that is a lot of the times critics will hype up an album as being weird and strange and experimental and out there, and you'll listen to it and you'll think, oh, this is just normal chart pop of the time, but he plays a clarinet on it, or maybe there's a little bit of a backwards guitar or a slightly different synth. For some reason, the artist who's coming to mind right now is David Bowie, which is not fair to David Bowie because he had a lot of projects that legitimately were really weird and strange and out there. And yet at the same time, he would have albums that would be very commercial and they would be very pop. And, you know, critics would write about those albums as though they were some sort of avant-garde, noise, jazz, electronic, industrial fusion thing, which, to be fair to him, some of it was, but not the albums that people wrote those reviews about. In any case, I'm rambling, and my friend who loves music journalists is probably going to have my throat for that. But in any case, let's start the review. The album starts off with some strange sounding percussion and a scream from Gabriel, which is swiftly followed by some big, foreboding synths, which set a pattern that is sustained for the duration of the song. The lyrics seem to be describing some sort of spiritual event that the protagonist is experiencing, but as I said, the tone is dark and ominous, with the frantic tribal drum beats that end the song almost implying a total loss of control on the narrator's part. San Jacinto finds Gabriel in full-on social commentary mode, singing a song from the perspective of a Native American man looking out on the city of San Jacinto on land stolen from his people, and seeing the continuing degradation of his people and the appropriation of his culture by white Americans. Musically, the track builds up from a repetitive synth loop to a massive anthemic chorus that somehow never really loses the artsiness of the verses. It's a definite highlight of this album, and one of the most emotionally powerful moments in Gabriel's entire discography. There are 3 songs on this album that just don't quite fit, that don't really gel with the rest of what's on here, and I Have the Touch is the first of these, a 3-minute pop song about enjoying social contact and the human need for interaction with others. The drum parts and the repetitive computerized nature of the song are kind of fun, but I'd be lying if I said it was one of my favorites here. The Family in the Fishing Net is the longest song on the album, clocking in at just over 7 minutes, and it's also my favorite track on here by a long shot. An ominous synthetic dirge about a marriage, in which this normally joyous occasion is sung about in terms that make you think that this is in fact a gruesome blood sacrifice to a terrifying elder god, rather than the joining of two peoples and two families. Oh, by the way, and I can't believe I almost forgot to mention this, that's Peter Hamill of Van der Graaf Generator doing the backing vocals in the choruses. The second of the Out of Place tracks, and the smash hit off this album, in fact, it was his first big hit in America. Shock the Monkey is undeniably a pop song, and a catchy one at that, and yet at the same time, I can't deny it is a weird, offbeat, repetitive song, and it's certainly not one that I ever would have predicted would have been as big a hit as it was. While shorter than its predecessors, Lay Your Hands on Me is essentially yet another rhythmic, repetitive dirge built around some angular drum patterns and atmospheric synths. As with I Have the Touch, the song seems to be about the human need for interaction and contact in an isolating and increasingly solitary world. 6 by 6 from wall to wall. Much like Biko from the previous album, Wallflower is an intensely political song about the plight of political prisoners facing torture and mistreatment for defying social injustice and totalitarianism. And over the course of the song, Gabriel voices both unanimous support for these political prisoners and condemnation for those responsible and complicit in their continuing suffering. The subject matter of Wallflower is much more obliquely handled than on something like Biko, which was about a very specific incident and a very specific set of injustices. But from what I've read, the primary inspiration for this track was the terrible human rights violations carried out throughout the 1970s and 80s by the various fascist regimes in South America. The production of the song is the most organic that you'll find on this album. And honestly, that's probably for the better. Something tells me that it would be a lot harder to take this song seriously if it had some tacky 80s synth plastered over the top of it. And speaking of tacky synths, Gabriel's first 4 albums all kind of struggled with the ending. The version of Here Comes the Flawed-On Car is way too overblown, while Scratch just kind of fades out with a whimper with Home Sweet Home. And while Biko is a fantastic song and one of a Gabriel classic, it doesn't gel well with the rest of Melt and ends the album on kind of an odd note. And Peter Gabriel 4 unfortunately continues this trend, ending with easily the weakest track on the entire album. The early 80s digital production is at its most obnoxious here. The lyrics are at their most trite, and while this is by no means a bad song, it is head and shoulders below everything else on this album. Perhaps most importantly, it's just not a good way to close things out, especially after a song as serious as Wallflower, after which this kind of just feels like whiplash. So the reason I chose to cover this album and not say Melt, which is still my favorite Peter Gabriel album, by the way, is mostly that I do have an more interesting personal history with this than I do with most of his albums, because I bought this many years ago on a whim after I had bought Melt. And Melt, I bought it blind on a whim, again on a whim. I had money, I was at the store, fell in love with it. It was everything I was looking for at the time. It was everything I needed at the time in the long shot, because Melt is an album that in the long run changed my musical outlook in a really, really positive way, and had a big influence on what I like in terms of music. But so I go to get Peter Gabriel 4 because I'd heard a lot of people say, you know, this is his second best one after Melt, because almost everyone agrees Melt's the best one. And if they don't think that Melt's the best one, they usually think it's either So or 4. But I'd heard that 4 was the second best one, so I was like, yes, I'm going to go get this. And so I did. And I got it home and I put it in, and I was just taken aback by it. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know what to say about it. And I didn't really like it, to be honest with you. I was very disappointed by it. And you know, it was too out there for me at the time. The 80s production was a turnoff. I was much more intolerant of the production sound of the 80s in those days. There was a time when 80s production was a deal breaker for me with music, where I was like, if this sounds like it was made in the 80s, I can't like it. And this was, of course, during my, what I like to call my metalhead phase. I was never really a metalhead in the Slayer sense, but there was a time when all I listened to was like the more accessible end of progressive rock and hard rock and a little bit of heavy metal. That was thankfully several years ago now. It wasn't the experimental part of progressive rock, and it wasn't the experimental part of metal. That's the important thing. So it was basically, yes, Genesis, Camel, little bits of Emerson, Lake and Palmer, but even then they were a bit too much for me. And the symphonic prog side of King Crimson, the early not smashing your face in with heavy riffs and like atonal frippings side of King Crimson. So my musical perspective in those years was very small. And this album I had no frame of reference for. This has got to be one of the first, maybe even the first actual like experimental pop album I ever bought. Because I was into Frank Zappa by that time, but I was not into the experimental side of him. Those were the days when I would skip the chrome-plated Megaphone of Destiny or Side 4 of Freak Out and just not listen to that part of the album at all. And so I put this album aside, and I'm not going to lie, it kind of killed my momentum with Peter Gabriel, because if I had liked this album, if I had fallen in love with the album, I believe I probably would have bought all the Peter Gabriel albums that year, but I didn't. And it took me another like year and a half to actually buy another Peter Gabriel album after this album. The flip side to this, the reason I'm even making the video, is that a lot of stuff changed over the last 2 to 3 years, and my perspective on this album has become more and more positive over time. In the last 2 years, I've listened to significantly more music from the time period where this was made than I ever did before. And so I finally came back to it not long ago and really, really came to appreciate the album for what it is, which is a triumph of the technology that was available at the time, a triumph of songwriting, a triumph of, you know, bringing in some new stuff that was not commonly found in popular music at the time. Because this is one of the albums that took quote-unquote world music, which in reality is basically African music. I don't quite know why it's called world music, but it's mostly African music, mainstream, and it made that stuff popular. These days, like I said, I would actually agree with the people who originally led me to this album in that this is probably the second best Peter Gabriel album. It's probably Melt, and then this album, and then maybe Scratch or maybe So. That's the ranking I would go in. But in any case, it's a great album. Do not make it your first, and maybe try and ease yourself into more music like this before you actually try to get into it. Or you may wind up kind of alienated the way I was, or who knows, maybe my initial disappointment with this album was entirely down to the environment and the kind of person I was at the time. But in any case, it's a fantastic album. I highly recommend it. And yeah, happy birthday to Peter Gabriel.